Our lesson this evening, we're going to look at kind of like the second chapter of where we were this morning, and we'll be in chapter 24 of Matthew part of the time. That's not the only place we're going to be, but there may be more there than from anywhere else. You here this morning know that we talked about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The real core of the gospel of Jesus Christ, he said, and the apostles then demonstrated as they were preaching and teaching in their ministry, is the death and the burial and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Even to the extent that our baptism represents the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Somebody pointed out that in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that we are saved by the gospel, by the obedience to the gospel. But the death, the burial, and the resurrection are in fact facts, and you can't obey facts. But we can obey the likeness of those things as we become dead to self and sin. We are in repentance, and we are then immersed in baptism as he was buried in the earth. Romans 6:3 is not many of us as are baptized into Christ have been baptized into his death. It's like the old man dies and the new man comes forth. And he says, if we've been, in verse 5, he says, if we've been buried with him in the likeness of his burial, we'll also be raised with him in the likeness of his resurrection. And so our obedience to the gospel in our being baptized fulfills the likeness of the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. Tonight, I wanted us to pick up from the point that Jesus ascended, not that we didn't get to the ascension today, and we didn't intend to, but to the point that he'd been resurrected. And you'll recall that the scriptures teach that for about 40 days after that, he remained with the brethren, encouraging the apostles and teaching them still further. And finally, Acts chapter 1 tells about him going out to Mount Olivet, and there where he ascended up into the heavens, and the angels stood by, verses 10 and 11 of Acts 1, saying to the apostles, ye men of Galilee, why do you stand here gazing up into the heavens? For the same Jesus you see going into the heavens will also come again in like manner as you see him going. But the return, what about when Jesus comes back? What do we know about that? There are many, many passages in the scriptures that address that. The Apostle Peter addresses it, and the Apostle Paul addresses it, and you can find a good many of the scriptures where those two writers addressed it. But I wanted tonight for us to just look at it from the perspective of what did Jesus say about his return. I'm going to try to prohibit myself from going to those other passages that come to mind from the ones about Jesus, and I want to look just at things that Jesus said about his return. I think it's interesting to do it that way. Now, I will not tell you that we're going to exhaust everything that you might say was something Jesus said about it, but we'll address enough for you to be satisfied with the time, I'm sure. And we're not able to use the screen tonight. I developed an outline that was an acrostic. And so let me tell you up front what the acrostic is so that you can kind of identify as we go along without me trying to paint word pictures all the way through. I wanted to say, bottom line, that Jesus said that his return is sure. S-U-R-E. We're going to have 1 point for the S and 1 for the U and 1 for the R, 1 for the E. And the first that we'll start with, the S, Jesus indicated that at least 3 things, as I see it, about his coming, that we could start with the S. One of them would be that it's going to be swift. When Jesus comes again, it'll be swift. It'll be something that happens quickly whenever it happens. Maybe quickly is a better word, but the swift is the one that I chose because it's the one that starts with an S. And so I couldn't change the other word. The first part, well, let me back up just a bit to say. Matthew chapter 24 is one of those passages where we often are speaking about the fact that we're not absolutely sure which ones of all the theologians are accurate, or if any of them are totally accurate, then so we say there's a great deal of debate about certain points. Matthew 24 is one of those chapters in which there's a great deal that is debated. And you can find people who are authorities on that chapter who say one thing, and you can find people who are authorities on it that say the opposite. And some say that whenever Jesus is talking in Matthew chapter 24, that he is talking about what will happen in connection with the great destruction of 70 AD, that it all relates to that. When you study it clearly, it seems to me that approximately the first half may in fact refer to 70 AD, but somewhere beyond the halfway point, it changes in its tenor, and it does seem more like, in that part, that he's talking about his return. I don't know any reason why there couldn't be that segue, no reason at all. You can't confine and say, well, chapter 24 has to all be about one thing, because other chapters aren't. Often we talk about the fact that we need to remember that the scriptures were not written in book, chapters, and verses, but just a flowing message. And consequently, am I in trouble? There's a man coming with a stick. I can hesitate. Did you do anything? All right. Well, I'm going to move on. Anyway, if we get the idea of boxing subjects into certain chapters and chapters being confined to certain subjects, then we lose the flow of Scripture. And so I think that what I'm saying kind of is part of what happens when you realize that it all came together without the separations that we distinguish today. And so it might not have seemed that way if we didn't have the books and the chapters, or the chapters and the verses in there. There it is, sure enough. Good help. Well, and man with stick, thank you. So I'm going to not deal so much with the first part, because I'll buy into that idea of it may deal just with 70 AD. But I think there's one passage in there that we're pulling from, and that the first one that we're using may in fact, no, it's not up in that part. Matthew 24 and verse 27. Jesus said that the coming of the Son of Man will be, and I love the graphic way he describes that. He said it will be as the lightning as it flashes from, I believe it's from the east to the west. And that evening in the summer, whenever those lightning storms occur, if you're brave enough to be out whenever it's playing every direction, and sometimes I've been driving through one of those. And one of my first trips here to Wichita, after I got on to I-35 off 412 coming up north, I got into a lightning storm that was just fascinating, because part of the time the lightning would be just flashing straight down to the earth. And there might be 2 or 3 of those happening at the same time. And then there'd be those that would across the sky like this, and the sky the other direction. And then there were those straight ones that just seemed to cover the whole span of all I could see from east to west in one moment. And Jesus must have seen those or created those, and he chose that to indicate the way, the speed, the quickness, the suddenness of when Jesus is coming. It is going to be also a sure thing. You change from that electric kind of sensation of quickness to the calmness of John chapter 14, beginning in verse 1, when Jesus assured the apostles and us, "Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me." And he said, "I go to prepare a place for you, that where I am, there you may be also. If it were not so, I wouldn't have told you." And so he said, I want you to come and be where I am. And he included the fact that in my Father's house there are many rooms. Now, most translations of the past have spoken of the fact that in my Father's, in this domain of my Father, there are many mansions. But the concept is that it's like it's a place that's big enough to accommodate everybody. So there are many rooms. We'll not debate tonight the issue of the fact that he's actually describing not a physical location like the biggest resort that you ever didn't see, but rather he's speaking of a spiritual existence. And since it's a spiritual existence, it doesn't require room. It doesn't require space. It doesn't require a place for us to be, for the spirits don't require 1,200 square feet for an apartment in which we live, or whatever size one might think of as a mansion, but as a dwelling place for the soul, where we can be at peace with him. And he is assuring us that this is not just some speech somebody's making, but this is real. I assure you. You don't have to worry. You don't have to fret. And you don't have to feel that when I have gone now, and he is about to go, that I will not come back for you. But I will come. And the third of those, and the S is soon. I will come soon. Revelation 22 has Jesus in verse 12, I believe, saying, "I am coming soon." Of course, at the end of the chapter, remember, John is praying, "Lord, come quickly, come quickly." Now, we could debate the soon for a while, but we won't. We could say, well, if Jesus said that just before he closed the book of Revelation, that was somewhere around 100 AD, we usually believe, and he's saying it's soon. And we say that wasn't so soon. It's been a good long while. Keep in mind that we're thinking in terms of years. We're thinking in terms of human existence. We're thinking in terms of people who live generally 70 years or so. Once in a while, as the psalmist said, it might be 70, and if by reason of strength we reach 80, yet is our strength labor and sorrow. It's not all fun after you get to be 80 or so, they tell me, and I kind of believe it. We had that funeral Friday for Miss Wilma Crane, who was 102, 5 months and 13 days. And still a lovely, lovely lady as she lay there in her casket. And it wasn't but 3 weeks ago till Harold Bott's mom was also buried, and she also had been wonderfully preserved and able to drive her car to church until she was 92 and had all of her faculties about her until she died, lived in her own home till then. Oh my, some people are so blessed with those things, and others would be blessed not to live so long because their lives are not that pleasant. But the idea of putting this into human terms and time is an inappropriate thing, because this is something that God's going to call. And I'll get to that passage in just a moment. But from God's perspective, whenever Peter was writing about that, he said in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 8, "But know this first, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are as 1 day." he's not saying use your calculator and do ratios with this, and 1 is equal to 1,000 in some problem-solving situation. Not at all. He's simply saying, here's an absurdity to try to illustrate what I'm talking about. With God, it doesn't matter whether it's 1 day or it's 1,000 years. The point is, he doesn't have to keep time. He didn't wake up this morning. He's not going to bed tonight. He didn't get born, and he isn't going to die. He doesn't get creaky bones like we do after a few years, and he doesn't have illnesses and threats of the things that might bring about his death. It's a different thing. So when Jesus said, I'm coming soon, it doesn't have to mean in terms of the way we count time, but it's, well, the next letter is a U for it's unknown. The time of his coming is unknown. It's uncertain as to when, but it is thoroughly certain that it will occur. And he says that it will come at a time that is unexpected. That's part of the process. You can't put a calendar on this. You can't set your watch by it because you don't know when it's going to be. There in the 24th chapter, isn't it, where he said in verse, trying to look at where that is it in the verses 20, chapter 24, 33, 36, is that the ones where he says, that day and that hour no man knoweth, not the angels nor the Son, but the Father only. That there's nobody who's able to say. Now, I've sometimes told people they'll come to a certain night of a gospel meeting or something that I'll tell them exactly when Jesus is coming again. And thinking that, well, boy, they know the scriptures teach that nobody knows, and who would I be to try to tell you that I know? Well, what I mean is, he's going to come exactly when God has it planned. That's how I know when he's coming. If you ask me what year or what time of the day or anything, I don't have a clue any more than anybody else does. And when people predict the day of the coming of the Son of Man, they're entirely out of line. And you know, and I could stand here and tell you several stories about people who have in the past picked certain days that they said, that's the day he's coming. There was a man in Garland, Texas, where I lived, who set a certain day. I believe it was in 1984, and he predicted it, and he got a lot of attention for it. The day came, and the day passed, and nothing happened. So someone asked him, what happened to your prediction? He said, what do you mean? Well, you said Jesus was coming yesterday, and he didn't. He said, oh, yes, he came. It's just that no one recognized him. But that's not the way the scriptures describe that either. With things like every eye shall see him and every ear shall hear him. Oh yes, and everybody will be called up to meet him in the air and the judgment will occur. No. But that town seems to have a history like that. During the time that I was on the city council, there's a group of people moved in from I don't know where. But there was about 100 families that came to town, and they had decided that Garland was the place where the Lord was going to return, and they had picked a day. They were some kind of cult. They bought houses and got settled in for the time that was going to come. I never could get an explanation for this unless it had something to do with signs, but they all bought Taurus cars. Ford dealer loved them. And the city had to pay, I think the number was something like, on the day that they said it was going to happen, I think it was $165,000 of expenses to the city in making preparation for safety and traffic and all the things that occurred. And the traffic occurred, and The precautions were necessary for the safety of the people, but Jesus didn't show. And whenever you hear people saying those things, in the early part of chapter 24, Jesus, whether he's talking about 70 AD or the second coming, he says, don't pay attention to what people say about the signs of when he's coming. If somebody says he's going to be here, I saw him there, he said, don't pay attention to that. In fact, in verse 5, he said, after my departure, many will come and will say, I am he, and they will lead away many after themselves. While people should be able to read in the scriptures to know that the time of his coming will be sudden, it'll be unexpected, it is sure, but it's unpredictable, except that it will occur, and we buy into all of that, we should know better. And yet, like Jesus said, they will lead away many after themselves. This time when Jesus comes, being unexpected, is illustrated and later on in the chapter when he talks about that there'll be some who will be unprepared. Remember, he also talked about that it'd be like in the days of Noah, and the people who they knew not until the day that Noah closed the door to the ark and the rain began to fall. They knew not until the water had consumed them. And so shall it be, he said, in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. Men will be eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage. I think that's in Luke. And he's just not saying that eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage are bad, wrong things. He's saying they'll be going about their normal way of life, doing everything they normally do, just going casually through life, and suddenly everything will stop, everything will change, unexpected, suddenly, and unpredictably so far as the specific time is concerned. He talks about the farmer, the owner of property who prepared a vineyard and wine press and a place to store the wine and everything. Then he went to another country. And when it was time for the harvest, he sent word that his servants should go and be paid for him for his share of the crop. But whenever the servants went, they beat him, they stoned one, and they killed one. They sent more, and similar things happened, and finally his son went. And they contrived among themselves, when they knew the son was coming, he's the heir. If we could do away with him, this might all just be ours. And so they killed him. And Jesus asked the disciples a question, what do you think that the master is going to do with those tenants? How do you think he's going to treat them? And then he goes back to the Psalms where the prophecy existed that the people would reject the cornerstone that God had sent. They rejected Jesus. And he's saying there's going to be a reckoning. And that'll be part of what we discuss also in regard to Jesus' teaching in regard to that. You can't forget Matthew 25, the first 13 verses. When you're talking about the unexpected, you realize that that's what the parable of the young women or the virgins is about. Jesus said that there was going to be a wedding, and there were 10 virgins, bridesmaids, and they went to wait for the ceremony. And the bridegroom, in those days, he was really, he was the center of things. That's kind of switched. It's a bride now. But the bridegroom seemed to have been the one that was really the honored one in the whole picture, and he delayed his coming. Now, they'd prepared some. Some had prepared more than others. 5 of them hadn't brought enough oil to last very long. They thought he'd be anxious and come quickly, but he didn't. When he delayed his coming, they ran out of oil. Then suddenly, at midnight, the call came, he's here, he's here. Everybody get up, trim your lamps, and let's go. And they tried to borrow from their fellow bridesmaids, and they said, we don't have enough for you and us. Go buy some for yourself. That's not a good thing to try to go and buy in the midnight. I doubt that there was a quick trip within, close to 2,000 years of them. They weren't going to be able to pull that off. In other communities, I might say 7-Eleven. But there was not a convenience store. There was not a situation like that. And Jesus said it's going to be that way with some people when the Son of Man comes. They may have made some preparation, but then they quit giving attention to keeping their lives trimmed and ready for the sudden, unexpected coming of the Lord. They won't be ready. And of course, when these young ladies in his parable come later, the bridegroom says, we're all closed now. You can't come in. It's too late. And with some people, apparently, it'll be too late. Because when Jesus comes, that R we're letting stand for there will be some revealing. It'll be a time when what we have done and who we are, how we've served, whether we've been honest and sincere, if our religion has really been based on righteousness, or if we've been hypocritical, all that's going to be opened up and everything will be seen. So it'll be revealing. As early as the 16th chapter of Matthew, not long after Jesus had promised, upon this rock I'll build my church, there in verse 27, he said that the Lord, when he comes, he will come recompensing every person, every individual for what he has done. He told the parable, you remember, of the man who went out early in the morning and found some people to work for him. And he made an agreement with them, the scriptures say. He made an agreement with them that he'd pay them 1 denarii, or denarius, for their day's labor, and they went to work. A few hours later, 9 o'clock, I think, he went out and found some other people who still were standing, waiting for work, and he hired them. At noon, he found others, and he hired them. At 3, he hired some more people. Finally, at 5 o'clock, he found people that were not yet successful in finding work. It would help us to understand that these are people who probably didn't have food for the next day. They worked that day for what it took. When Jesus said in the prayer model, ask God to give us this day our daily bread, he was talking to people who usually would at most have 1 day of provision, and then they had to go and find it or earn it or something for the next day. And so he's talking to people who know that kind of circumstance. And these people had apparently been willing to work. I like that about them. It's 5 o'clock. And they are still at the place. Some cities have a place. I haven't seen one here in Wichita yet, but in other cities where I've lived, I've known where they were. And there was something that was almost like a bus station where people could come who didn't have work for the day, and they could stay. And some contractor may drive in a van or a pickup truck, and he will call out how many people he needs and the trade or the kind of ability they need to have, and everybody can get in. His pickup gets in. Sometimes he has to put some out. That's more than what he wanted. And then he may question them some to make sure they really can do the job that he wants them to do. He may want to try to be sure that they're able to swing a sledgehammer if that's what he needs. That kind of culling and qualifying. But there were places like that apparently in the time of Jesus. And the folks would have known that the man went back to the work center, the job center. And there he found people as late as 5 in the afternoon who were willing to work but hadn't found work yet, and he hired them. They worked 1 hour, and it was quitting time. And when quitting time came, he called the people in, and he gave them each the same amount. He paid the people who had worked 1 hour the same as the ones who'd worked 10 hours. They complained. That's not fair. And the master said, well, that's what you agreed to work for. I've paid you what you agreed to work for. And then he said, you need to keep in mind that I'm the boss. And I can pay whoever I want to, however amount I want to. If I had cheated you, that'd be one matter, but I haven't. And if I want to give the ones who only work 1 hour the same amount as you do, I'm the one who's doing the paying. It's none of your business. When Jesus comes, he'll separate the tares from the wheat, remember? He talked about that. He'll separate the sheep from the goat, discussed in Matthew 25. I'm tempted, but I'll stay away from what the Apostle Paul said about the potter and the clay, but maybe you know. I'm trying to stay with what Jesus said. Jesus says when this revealing occurs, it'll be based on the experience that God has had in seeing how we lived, not what we claim to be, but whether we really were faithful and true and sure in our commitment to him. It'll all become open and revealed. I've often wondered just how that's going to be accomplished. We think of all the people who've ever lived upon the earth. I can't even imagine everybody that's alive on the earth today. 7.5 billion, or maybe approaching 8 now. I can't think 1,000 very well. And when you get to 100,000, 1 million, 1 billion, that's just amazing. I remember, you might enjoy a little anecdote into my coffee drinking buddies down in Florence, Alabama. It was just at the time that we, I believe, had heard that the national debt had gone to 15 billion, or no, trillion, $15 trillion. One guy was sitting there and he said, what comes after 15 trillion? And the fellow who's a banker said, 16 trillion? We can't imagine the numbers, and we question that. But when every soul comes before the Lord and the books are opened and everything is revealed, is it going to be kind of like a video of my life? And it kind of scares me. You know, you got any things in your life you'd rather not have revealed? Back there somewhere, sometime? Mm-hmm. Well, grace is a wonderful thing, isn't it? That when God forgives, he forgets. And though it might have been on the reel at one time, it won't be now. It'll be gone. But what if you went up before the Lord and on some big screen, your life just quickly played out before all your family, your children, your mother, and everything you ever tried to hide, and it all was there? Whoa. I don't know how that's going to be accomplished, except that I know God can handle it. And yet, I think it's real important for me every day I live to keep myself cognizant of the fact that when Jesus comes again, it's going to be revealing. It's all going to be out there in the presence of the Lord. Whatever has not been forgiven will still be there. I deal with people almost every day. You would anticipate that would be the case, who already know what God wants them to do. They've had the plan of salvation explained to them. They've been taught. They've been exposed. And yet, for some reason of their own, they continue to put off, to delay, to think, I'll do that later. I'll have another opportunity. What a risk that is, when the revealing day may be much, much closer than what we've anticipated. It is unsure as to when. And Jesus said that When that time comes, the separation occurs. In Revelation 20, he talks about the fact that the devil and his angels will all be cast into the lake of fire that burns forever and ever. And that leads us to the E. Jesus said it'll be eternal. He said it'll be everlasting. In Matthew 25, he says that to those on the left, the Lord will say that you will depart from me into everlasting torment. Everlasting. Eternal. It's described as where the worm dies not, where the flame doesn't end. Eternal. Everlasting. And in Revelation, he says the devil and his angels will be there. And it'll be eternal. Now, it's real easy these days to find someone who will seek to convince you that eternity isn't eternal. I don't understand. There are brethren, preachers in the church, who make their main hobby, I'll call it, their main thing that makes them famous or infamous, depending on who's giving the evaluation, is their teaching that hell won't be eternal. They teach that if there is a fire, that our soul will be kind of like a piece of paper, and it'll burn up, and that's that. There won't be any more to it, that's all. That I just was on TV today hearing that the Pope has decided that hell's not real, and that the only hell there is separation from God. And that would be enough, really. That's how, I promise not to get into Paul, but he described it as separation of the presence of the Lord and the glory of his power forever and ever. Sounds like the way Jesus described it. And there's a two-sided blade there. One is the suffering of the punishment per se. The other is the anguish of knowing I didn't have to be here. I didn't have to do this. I could have escaped. I could have been saved. And I'm separated from God and the righteous people, and here I am thrown into this hell with all the people who didn't qualify for heaven. We avoid bad neighborhoods if we can for our own homes, don't we? Why on earth would someone want to live in that kind of neighborhood for eternity and punishment and anguish? And it's more than just being separated from God. And often, the same person who maintains that hell is kind of a flash in the pan thing wants to believe that, in fact, heaven is eternal, that it is everlasting. But absolutely the same words are used to describe the duration of hell as is used to describe the duration of heaven. I mean, the same one. Whether you're going into Greek or English or whatever, it's the same word. It'll last the same amount of actually non-time. Because the best definition that I know for eternity is the absence of time. There won't be any more time. When we enter into that realm like God, when one day is as 1,000 years and 1,000 years are as one day, it won't be counted in calendar days and years. It will just be without end. That's one of the beautiful, beautiful, wonderful parts of the description of heaven. But isn't it a fearful part of the description of hell? And our Jesus said those words, everlasting and forever. Jesus said, when I come again, the judgment will occur. There will be a separation. And the separation that occurs when I come quickly for this unexpected visit, that's when judgment will be. The question tonight is not whether Jesus is coming again. The question is whether we are ready for him to come, whether we're ready to meet him. One more time, by the grace of God, we get to sing a song of encouragement. And if you know in your heart, and you're the one who would know, that you've not obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ, or if you have become out of harmony with God by sin in your life, for the sake of your soul, use the opportunity. Let us help you get right with God for the first time or again. But don't play games. Please, please, don't take chances. You've just got one soul. And you might just have this one more opportunity. If you need to come right now while we stand and sing.